a speech from Professor Richard Hodges about the Butternut World Heritage Site. So as Europeans, people who've lived here for generations, as well as people who have newly arrived, we have to take full responsibility for transmitting the heritage in good shape for future generations. Europa Nostra is the leading citizens' movement to protect and celebrate Europe's cultural and natural heritage. We're the voice of all who believe that cultural heritage is vital for our economy, our society, our culture, our environment, and our well-being, and for the future of Europe. Europa Nostra UK is a UK-based charity that supports Europa Nostra. Our aims are to nurture enthusiasm for our shared European cultural heritage, to articulate the values and ideas that connect us to our colleagues in Europe, to raise the profile of EN UK in order to support Europa Nostra's Europe-wide representation, to foster links and cooperation with our European heritage bodies in civil society and beyond, and to sustain the UK participation in shaping European heritage policy and vice versa. As I said, tonight we are delighted to bring you the fourth webinar in our series of Europa Nostra UK webinars, showcasing recent European Heritage Award winners, both from the UK and projects elsewhere that might inspire organisations from the UK. The European Heritage Awards / Europa Nostra Awards were launched in 2002 by the European Commission and have been run by Europa Nostra ever since. This year marks the 21st anniversary of Europe's most prestigious awards in the heritage field. The awards identify and promote best practice in the conservation and enhancement of tangible and intangible cultural heritage, stimulate the trans-frontier exchange of knowledge throughout Europe, increase public awareness and appreciation of Europe's cultural heritage, and encourage further excellent initiatives through the power of example. So first, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get on to the main event, and I hand over to our guest today. So please, during the lecture, do use the chat if you have any questions. We'll pick them up at the end, where we do have a chance for a Q&A with Graham. Anything that you do put in the chat or any questions that you ask, we do ask, obviously, you just keep it friendly. And as I think we were all notified at the start, this session is being recorded and then will be posted on our YouTube channel at the end. Now I've done that, I'd like to introduce the topic of tonight's webinar. Our speaker is Graham Hickey, Chief Executive of the Dublin Civic Trust, who has worked at the organisation since 2008. In 2021, the Dublin Civic Trust received the European Heritage Award for the restoration of 18 Ormond Quay Upper and the 1840s merchant building in the historic centre of Dublin. It was restored by the Trust over a 3-year period since 2017 as a demonstration project under its revolving fund mechanism, showing how historic buildings in the centre of Dublin can be sensitively restored with a residential component. This is the 8th building the Trust has restored since its foundation in 1992, and the first award Ireland has won in Europa Nostra's conservation category since the Office of Public Works was awarded in 2005 for its restoration of Victorian Great Palm House complex in the National Botanic Gardens. So Graham has joined us to tell you how they achieved this and what lessons they have learned as a result. So I shall bring that bit to a close and hand over to you, Graham.
Thank you so much, Ollie. Thank you, Kate. Thank you both for this invitation to talk to you today. You'll be happy to know my presentation. It is entirely picture-based. I don't think there's a word of text in it. There might be one. So we talk to images. I think that's usually the best way to communicate all of these themes that we're all familiar with, and hopefully not bore you to death in the process. Now, can I begin this? There we are. So thank you all. Hello, everybody from Europa Nostra UK. Some of you, no doubt, may have been to Dublin before, some of you not. A.A. Gill, the late A.A. Gill, I remember he wrote one of his articles was to the people of Britain, if you haven't done Dublin yet, do it. before things change. And I think as the city rapidly changes to a really spectacular degree, certainly during the Celtic Tiger period of the 2000s, and now there's been an enormous resurgence of change and international investment capital pouring into the city to the degree that, as we were just discussing before I came on air, probably the most successful European capital city by way of international investment tumbling in. But the consequences in terms of the historic landscape and a fairly undeveloped conservation sector is troubling. But perhaps we'll go through some of those themes as I go through this presentation. So this is Dublin in the 19th century. I'm happy to say at least this scene, very little has changed. It's a magic scene. And the essence of Dublin is it is essentially a Georgian city. Certainly up until the late 1950s, it was considered the most intact Georgian city in these islands outside of the city of Bath. Mainly because in Dublin, we really didn't have an industrial revolution of the scale of the 19th century that you had in Britain. We had a primarily agrarian agricultural economy. So our city, we had a Georgian city almost preserved in aspic for really development largely halted in the 1830s. And the Great Famine, of course, that happened in Ireland in the 1840s when 18 Ormond Quay was built, in many ways marked the finish of the development of the city until Edwardian and later interventions came in. So the city was very readably Georgian. You can see all of these dolls' houses jostling for attention along the city quays, punctuated by major neoclassical buildings. It may be surprising that Dublin was considered the second city. I know every city in these islands competes as being the second city, but by way of scale and by way of economic prowess, up until 1800, until the year 1800, up until the large development of the northern cities in Britain, Dublin was considered economically the second city of the empire. The Act of Union, of course, when Parliament was recalled from Dublin and was amalgamated back with Westminster, changed the entire nature of the city. All of the investment, the aristocracy flooded from Dublin. And I suppose that was really the turning point, even earlier than the 1840s, that kind of preserved the Georgian city in its decaying state. And it's interesting, when we had the privilege of collecting our Europa Nostra award in Venice, we were struck by, as Ollie was discussing earlier, the universal themes and values of European cities. In Venice, perhaps many of the elements individually are unremarkable, but collectively they form an extraordinary urban achievement, a human achievement, a universal value. And in Dublin, we have that in spades as well, not only in terms of the riverscape, which you can see here, but the large Georgian districts of red brick streets, of Georgian squares, which is a wonderful kind of, what would you call it, the westernmost location of the European Enlightenment, which that spans from Central Europe to the great stone-built cities of the north of Britain to the stock brick you get in London. And then the Irish equivalent is brick for the most part. We are a resolutely brick city. It's really only our public buildings that are built of local granite and dressed with Euro Portland stone. But for the most part, we are a brick city. So it gives almost like a Philadelphia type flavor, I suppose, to the city, which is quite interesting, quite warm. And in Dublin Civic Trust, we were established, as Ali mentioned, in 1992 to lead by example. There's different with the Irish Georgian Society. It's been around since the 1950s. We have An Taisce, which is kind of the National Trust for Ireland, which all have their individual remits. Neither is charged, as it were, with restoring buildings. They engage a lot with policy. They engage a lot with the big country house sector, which is a very contested, or was anyway, contested in Ireland for most of the 20th century with the colonial associations. And therefore, we aim to lead by example in trying to preserve what was by then, in the 1990s, the decaying core of Dublin. And so to demonstrate through a revolving fund mechanism of acquiring what were then exceptionally cheap street buildings, what today cost an absolute fortune, but back then we were able to acquire one under favorable terms. And since that time, we've been able to snowball gradually that fund into different buildings. And this is just an array of the structures that we've done over that time. You can see they're all brick built in different forms. You can see how they've been transformed from cement render, I hope you can see my cursor there, to the brick that was lurking underneath, putting manors back on the streetscape, as well as conserving the interiors, which range from 17th century to 18th, right through to the Regency period. And I suppose the focus of this conversation is our latest project at 18 Ormond Quay Upper. It's called Upper because there's a lower quay as well. It's an exceptionally long quay through the centre of the city. And it's what looks like kind of often called a dog food canning factory on the river, far from it. But what are actually two handsome 19th and 18th century buildings conjoined. They were originally good merchant premises that in the 1960s received this coat of pebble dash, which radically changed their appearance. But we could see there was, like in Britain, so many different layers of Roman cement we could see on the ground floor, which probably dated to the 1840s. These much smaller windows in the back building, which suggested that the back building was older than the front. I suppose then we decided to, well, like any good conservation project, is to drill into the documentary records. And so, for example, we have John Rock's map of Dublin from 1756. This was drafted after Rock's map of London, about 10 years later. So he had refined his skill, and at the time it was the most comprehensive, detailed map of any European city, pretty quickly eclipsed by other ones, but at the time it was very impressive. And this was very useful in showing the front building here and what we think is the back building at this point, with two other houses adjacent to it. And you can just see the layout there. And so what we decided to do before we actually got the conservation underway, to communicate these themes to the public of how the city has evolved over time and to give a better understanding of the built fabric of the city, is that we think that the front building originally looked like this. It was a gable-fronted, what are called Dutch Billy houses in Dublin, on account of the fashion of these curvilinear gables that became very popular after the Battle of the Boyne, with the ascent of King William III. And so Dublin went in very much in the opposite direction to London, where flat parapets and mansard roofs came in. In Dublin, these extraordinary curvilinear gables were literally stuck onto what were otherwise Georgian houses. So for the first half of the 18th century in Dublin, most of the city, of the fashionable city, was composed of these gable-fronted houses. So we know that this was the front building in about 1740. And we think about 10 years later, 3 fashionable houses that you saw on Rock's map were built at the back. 2 of them were subsequently demolished. The back building is the one that we have today. And what we think happened in the late 18th century is that the gables were removed off the building and it was made look Georgian, which was the big campaign in the city from about 1750 onwards. So that's kind of the basis of the buildings that we have today. We're pretty sure, though, that, looking at the fabric of the front building, that most of it is actually mid-19th century, 1840s. And sure enough, our title deeds really threw up the detail that the former house on the site, the gable-fronted house, was decayed and in danger of falling, and it had to be rebuilt in the space of 6 months between October 1842 and April 1843. So we're pretty sure the building was effectively collapsed to the ground. The very nice shop front that we have was probably predates the building, was retained, and then it was rebuilt as this fashionable 1840s merchant premises, with the older house still clinging on at the back. So hopefully that gives you some sense of that. We're still trying to get our heads around it. It's incredibly bewildering. We also drilled through the documentary record, looking at lovely lease title deeds, and this wonderful, charming, what would you call it, a panorama of Dublin. Pretty much most of the commercial streets of the city were drawn for this commercial directory in 1850, and there was only one of them ever produced. This is a theme I think some cities in Britain have. I think there's some of London. You might enlighten me later on. Certainly was a big, very popular motif in US cities at the time as well in the 19th century, to draw commercial streets. And this was really useful because it captured 18 Ormond Quay just about 7 years after it was built. So we could work out that the entrance was originally in the middle. There was these kind of little ventilation grills under the windows. And then we drilled into 19th century photographs, and you could see already things were falling apart. You could see these yieldy, worldy kind of Victorian painted timbers were applied onto the side elevation and onto the front. Looking at typical street scenes where you could see the building evolving over time. The very last use before we bought it about 8 years ago was a hunting and fishing tackle shop, which closed about 20 years actually before we bought it, maybe 18 years before it. So we looked at the documentary record. We looked at the building itself to work out all of the changes over time. For example, a grocer moved into the shop. Edward Corcoran was his name. We turned up in the leases, and sure enough, there's his cipher in the glass. And then inside, interesting things that you're all familiar with. The rear facades of buildings are often older than the front. In this case, the staircase was obviously older than the building. We think it dates from the late 18th century, and we think it was actually recycled from the previous house on the site. This is the horror show that greeted us inside, blocked up windows at the back. This is a link through into the back building. You can see the entire party wall of the staircase, the spine wall, had been removed. And then in the rear building, got very exciting, these lovely, I don't know what you call them in Britain, lugged architraves, we call them here, which are very characteristic of the mid-18th century. Good mid-18th century cornices still surviving. And then this wonderful Rococo cornice. And Dublin was, you're probably familiar with, is celebrated for its stucco work for the inside of the houses. The outside they're like barns, they're like barracks, very plain brick buildings, and then sumptuously decorated, wild decoration inside. And that's a good example of that. So you can see here the lean on the gable wall of the building, very pronounced, leaning out into the side street. And this is the laser survey that showed us exactly that. No surprises for where the hopper, the downpipe, the moisture, the rotting bonding timbers were, all in this hot area between the two buildings. And then when we stripped kind of modern liners and everything from within the shop, another structural problem was how skinny the piers of the shop front were. They're pretty narrow outside, and they were just literally a brick and a half, give or take, supporting the arches on the inside. So from a conservation standpoint, we had two options, either to literally dismantle the gable wall down to a first floor level, down to the sill level, and onto the scaffolding and rebuild it, or else could we go about actually holding it in position, and that's the solution that we came up with. So this fairly monumental series of steels were devised to be applied onto the inside face of the staircase wall, and then they were to be tied through. And that's what happened. So they've all been tied through the floors into the spine walls. And you can also see that lots of heli fixing was called up. A lot of this wasn't needed, thank goodness. We could actually omit a lot of the stitching, and we could also omit most of the pattress plates. Our engineer came up with a fairly nimble device of using a hooped piece of metal that could append itself onto the steels, and it could be covered over by a full brick, not even a slip, but a full brick, so it properly weathered, concealed within the fabric. And these fairly hefty L-shaped steels were devised around the shop front. Just the logistics of getting this stuff into the building, this is a floor tie, and even just getting your drill down between these fairly tight joists to drill all of these holes, and then to feed a fairly rigid threaded bar all the way through is no mean feat. So it's a credit to our conservation contractor, who's the main contractor. It was a contract overall for, give or take, about 450,000. And Nolan's Group, who are a good, reputable conservation firm in Dublin, and they really came up trumps with this. Other smaller solutions were kind of a steel frame in the shop to give greater rigidity to the building, and bow ties, which you might be familiar with. These are very low tech, easy, minimal intervention for tying the facade into the floor structure. Some familiar elements had to come out in order for the steels to go in. It also gave an opportunity for example, this lovely Edwardian vestibule to be a refurbishing workshop and to be brought back to site again. We had to double up with a ply on the floors. In order to give structural rigidity to the building, so the floorboards are all carefully numbered. You can see they're also blade numbered in per batch. And even where the boards were split, as you can see, historically, they were put back in their original position, and they did a fabulous job on coordinating that. the biggest challenge, I suppose, is the removal of this fur coat of pebble ash from the outside of the building. This is the huge expanse on the gable. So I don't know if you of course you've pebbled ash all over Britain from the early 20th century. This continued in Ireland certainly up until the 1960s. And when lime work and fine tuck pointing and everything went by the wayside, this was the easy solution for dicking up a street building, was just to cover it in cementitious pebble ash and all of the problems that come with that, and trapping moisture in behind, and the rigidity that it introduces to an otherwise flexible building. So this is the process. Nolan's group, they assured us we did lots of trial removals, and using pneumatic hand tools and using them carefully. Conservation officers often specify hand tools, but if you have a good operative and you have a small device, it can be done. And certainly our conservation officers in Dublin have come around to the right contractors and the right application of mechanical tools. We were extra lucky here. You can see on the brick that it was painted. So even though the pebble dash went on in the 60s, the brick was probably painted in the 1940s. And actually, we have good RAF photographs of Dublin from the 1930s, I think. I'm not sure what the RAF were doing in the 1930s over Dublin, but this is a glowing white box on the corner. So at least it proves that it was painted. So it delaminated fairly easily compared to if the building hadn't been painted. It's careful, of course, important to look for evidence as you're going along. So when the cementitious reveals were falling off around the windows, the original lime feathered reveal, which is a detail I think you have in Georgian buildings in Britain as well, where it was lurking underneath. So that gave us a good cue. All of this gunk then had to come off. So that was another layer of the cleaning. For the most part, we used steam, hot steam, to remove the paint. This is the process underway. And in some cases, minimal chemical application had to be used where there was more stubborn pieces. But that's the brick brought back, also raked out as well of cement. It revealed lots of problems along the way, dodgy window heads that had to be rebuilt. And then on the evidence front again, this is the sole surviving sample of wigging, what's known as wigging in Dublin. I suppose tuck pointing to you. Wigging is an Irish variant of tuck pointing. In Britain, you apply the coloured mortar first, and then you draw the fine ribbon over the still green mortar underneath. In Ireland, we do it the other way around. So the white mortar goes in first, and you cut out the ribbon in the white mortar, and then the next day you come back and you apply the coloured mortar over it. So it's the reverse process. You can see just important details like the horizontals are about twice, if not three times the thickness of the perp ends. So that's of the perpendiculars. So that's a detail that we replicated. These are the samples that we went through, and that's the process underway. So you can see the joints are stuffed with mortar, and then it's very finely cut out, and then the coloured mortar is laid over it. A pretty skilled process, and then the finer tidying up details. And that's the finished product. I mean, to people not involved in conservation, even to those in conservation, I mean, this can look a bit crude. I mean, you are looking at a lot of mortar, but it's the traditional detail. We were very conscious to have as much brushback as possible, so they are looking at as much of the patination of the brick as possible. And also in the case of the coins, we didn't want to draw white lines around like a child might do around the coins. So we specified a silvery mortar around the granite so that it wouldn't actually read as a standout element, which is quite nice. And we kept the original sample of pointing on the side. This is always the nail biting minute when the scaffolding is coming down, and that's the finished result. And the windows were brought back to an early 19th century color. I have to say, mea culpa here, they actually weren't supposed to be this cherry color, and it's very instructive as you learn as you go along. I inspected the color samples of the sashes in the room rather than outside, so they looked a lot darker inside. So they're a little more poppy than they otherwise might be. They should be more of a purple brown, but they still have a good character to them. We kind of drilled through the photographic record there as well of looking at the building in the 19th century. It didn't have chimney pots like a lot of buildings in the city up until the 1850s. And so that's what we specified. The chimneys had all been dismantled in the 1980s. So we rebuilt them back to their original height, and we capped them with slate and lime. And another learning curve, we didn't allow for ventilation, which is fine because most of the flues are actually blocked anyway, but we should have allowed some ventilation for one or two of the flues that are fully open. So we're actually going to pop some bricks out and put ventilating bricks in their place. And on the shop front, this beautiful piece of monumental public architecture was really lurking underneath about 50 layers of paint and junk that had accumulated over the years. And our architect, James Kelly of Kelly & Cogan Architects, the conservation architect, really went to the ends of the earth in drawing and specifying these windows. We were very conscious that we didn't know what the original window configuration was, even from Shaw's pictorial directory. So, but we did know the entrance was in the middle, as we saw earlier, and also actually the pavement lights indicated the same. So we decided that we would keep these beautiful cable molded frames, and this one would actually be moved over to here. This was all a modern 1970s door case. So we decided to move that over and then to stitch in within the Dublin tradition historic glazing bars back to the 1840s profiles, and these very what James always calls funereal doors, you know, the miserable 1840s. And we were kind of conscious to evoke the interesting aesthetic of that period. And we looked at examples all over the city of the type of ventilation grills that are used and historically were used under shop windows. Our cast iron foundry, the Bushy Park Ironworks, they literally got down on their hands and knees at this building not too far away, and they took an imprint of the molding and they recast it for us. These are the windows under manufacture by Lamb's Tongue, the specialist joiners. The frames are Sipile, tropical hardwood. This is about 7 years ago. We wouldn't be using that today. The astragals are European oak. We're much more conscious now of where we're sourcing materials from, and it's difficult. It's not easy, and the mass market goes one way, and you're the difficult customer looking for something different from what everybody else wants. That's not easy, and you're paying more for it as well. The lead time is longer, but somebody needs to trigger the change in you know, on sustainability grounds of where our materials come from. And really, we should only be using either European oak, Douglas fir, or Akoya for standard joinery, to be honest. This is the windows underway. We decided to oak grain them very simply, an oak scumble, very typical of the 1840s. And the lamps we reinstated. These are lovely wrought iron hoops, hand-blown globes, and these copper hats, which were made in Belfast. They were copper spun in Belfast. And this is the wonderful, literally the kit of parts that our blacksmith there in the photograph, Paul Devlin, he drew it up and just by hand. It's absolutely wonderful. And then he hand beat the already spun elements into an authentic Dublin shape of oil lamps from the 1840s. With LED bulbs in them today, the lovely glass there. That's the finished product of the windows brought back. I mean, it's interesting, certainly in Dublin, in Ireland, there is, I would have to say, a hegemony of sensibility of modernism, and the degree, you know, of I think taking the Venice Charter to the nth degree, that the monument must have readable interventions. And we're of the opposite view when it comes to street buildings. Whatever about monuments or significant buildings, but street buildings, there's a tradition there, and the identity of the city is founded on those traditions of joinery and masonry and plasterwork, and it is entirely, we feel, within the philosophy of our conservation in a city that is denuded of historic elements, to bring back those historic elements appropriately. And even if we didn't know what was there, this is very informed conjecture and it's informed design, and we're very happy and we're very content with what we've done here. And that probably wouldn't be to the taste of most architects in Dublin. And yet when they see this, I think they do see the value of it, even if they won't admit it, dare I say. This is the shop before and after. I think it's worth saying shop spaces are of enormous value. This is the white box, can be of enormous value to street buildings in towns and cities across our islands. For the most part, tenants are usually offered a white box that they do a full fit out on, of suspended ceilings and coffee machines and all the rest of it. And yet I think if most tenants are offered what is effectively a plain traditional box with 2 chimney breasts, with the cornice reinstated, a fireplace, a good floor, you can do anything with that space. We have had weddings here, we've had lectures, we've had pop-up shops, we've had full retail, we've had every type of use here. And it's like it's just wonderful host to any type of function. And I think a lot of property owners should be a lot more attuned to that, of actually bringing back some of that character. It can add flexibility and a broader range of tenants. Rather than narrowing the field, I think it can actually improve things. That's the vestibule reinstated, the chimney breast in the front, which so many people whack out of shops, and we went the opposite way and made a feature of it, and everyone loves it. And that's upstairs with the ceilings brought back, simply done. I'm just conscious of time here, so it'll be about 5 minutes or so. Yes, we did try to do thermal upgrade. It's a tussle, as you know well, where you have historic features and historic plaster. You want to keep it, you want to be able to see it. You don't want to compromise the joinery and the elements. So we compromised, I suppose, wherever parts of the building that had been interfered with in the 20th century and had lost their features. So 2 rooms in particular on the upper floors, that's where we put the insulation. So in this case, we used a calcium silicate board, Calcitherm, if I mentioned brand names. And on the base of it, the scud coat is a cork lime plaster. So it's actually, you can use the two together, the Dyson cork lime as a scud, and then the Calcitherm over. And that's the process underway. And we've had training sessions of architects having CPDs. We've had 20, 30 architects round into these small rooms. And this actually is not our building, but it's just a demonstration of how the cork lime plaster goes on. It's really wonderful because it goes on like a mousse one day, and literally the next day you can come back and you can put the top coat on, which is a world away from the lead time or the curing time of traditional 3-coat lime work. You get a very good wrap as well in areas where the shutter boxes are missing, wrapping around the backs of the granite sills that you can see there. And granite is a particularly good conductor, so it's good to get the wrap over it. That's the lovely finish of what is that the finish of? That I should know. That is the finish of the calcitherm board, of the skim coat that goes over it. Sorry, it's not. It's the cork lime on the top floor. That's the cork lime. And apparently in Italy, where it's been used in Ancona, where they make it and they have the training courses, it's been used for about 50 years. And in many cases, they leave it exposed like that. They don't even paint it. It almost has a lime finish inside, which is particularly attractive. And then wherever we had historic finishes, we just did the patch repair, and we wanted wobbly walls, we want wobbly ceilings. In fact, this is the front room where we use the calcitherm, but we also saved the ceiling in the process as well, using the wire and washer method. So that was the room before, denuded of elements. There had been a fire in this room actually in the 1970s. And that's the shutter boxes brought back. Dublin buildings, like all of your buildings, they're usually a kit of parts. There's usually 5 materials in these buildings, brick, stone, plaster, glass, timber. And then there's usually a hierarchy of 3 moldings, 3 skirtings, 3 cornices. So we simply copy the elements on the same floor of this room and reinstated them. And I always show this slide, I suppose, because this is the scale of drawing that's needed. We no longer operate in a tradition anywhere, give or take. I mean, well, of course, there's exceptions to that in the art world and to some degree in some crafts. But for the most part, the mass market is we don't have a tradition, and therefore, if you wanted to survive, you have to draw the tradition. The tradition is usually in people's head, kind of an unconscious set of rules. And if nobody knows the rules, and nobody seems to know them anymore, we have to draw them. And this I can try to hammer home with architects. You don't just go to the window company, don't go to the joiner that's been recommended. You need to tell them exactly what to make. And then it sinks in. I think it's beneficial all around that they then learn from the process, and perhaps they'll turn out these moldings hopefully on new builds as well as old ones. Dublin is regularly wrecked. Planning enforcement is almost non-existent when it comes to historic buildings. So around the corner, a building was being gutted. Rather than this going to landfill, we whipped out the lovely 18th century newels and we reinstated them in our own building when we were reinstating missing stairs in the basement and in the ground floor, and they worked perfectly. And then we, in Dublin Civic Trust, we bring buildings to different levels of finish. In some cases, we carcass them. In other cases, we occupy them ourselves. In this case, we decided to bring the building somewhat back to the spirit of what it looked like when it was built. At least bring back some of the logic of what is a shutter box, and did a shutter box stand out from the walls? What was the room originally used for? And you're familiar with lots of these drawings of traditional interiors. And the quays in Dublin along the river, they were the center of wallpaper manufacturing. Apparently, there was as many wallpaper manufacturers in Dublin as in all of London at the same time in the 1820s and the 1830s. And then, unlike London, it was completely wiped out here in the 1840s, from 1850 maybe onwards, with mechanization and French wallpapers flooding the market. But these are lovely examples made, well, horrible examples made in Dublin along the quays in the 1840s. We engaged David Skinner, the wallpaper expert in Ireland. He's an expert in Britain as well. And he got a lot of these copies. A lot of these Irish wallpapers are held in the National Archives in Kew. And so he got good high resolution copies, and showed us, and actually this is just an example of some of the wallpaper manufacturers along the quays in Dublin. So he showed all these horrible designs and said, no, no, no. And then and we also did some, shall we say, kind of car key paint analysis. We weren't going the whole hog. We kind of just scraped layers to get a sense of the colors that were used over time. You can see oak graining, of course, number one with the light ground, and then the top, and then this green is probably late 19th century. The sludge probably 1910, and then titanium white from the 1970s perhaps. So these are the traditional wallpapers that David that we selected with him, that were made literally a stone's throw from the building. Via Kew, and in this case, this one was made in Manchester, laser printed in Manchester. Other ones he's screen printed for us, which I'll show you. These are the rooms just stitched back together again, these wonderful papers. I think the logic of these rooms is based on strong joinery popping out against fairly neutral wallpaper patterns. We think of kind of Wedgwoody, Jane Austen kind of tones in historic buildings, but in fact, wallpaper was the dominant theme for most of the 18th and 19th century in Ireland, certainly. I think large parts of Britain as well, contrasted against brown furniture. So these are just some befores and afters of rooms brought back. I should say, of course, the upper floors, that the 3 stories above were residential accommodation historically, with a grocer shop on the ground floor, separate. They weren't actually connected. And so we kept it on that basis with a residential unit above the shop. And it might look expensive. It's really not. Brown furniture, as you know, is as cheap as chips. Nobody wants it. We actually just get loans of it, or we buy it cheaply at auction for less than 100 quid, and we fill the rooms, and we bring back the elegance of these spaces. The chandelier was the only. In fact, we won the Europa Nostra, and we thought, oh my goodness, there's going to be a lot of press publicity. So it's the only thing we splashed out on, which is a cut glass chandelier. Even though Ireland is famous for glass, this is probably an Osler chandelier made in Birmingham, I'd imagine, in 1850. This is the kind of a wild William IV pattern that we brought back in the first 4 rooms. So that's the building as it was. That's the manner it's brought back to the outside of it. Quite a transformation. We often say if every building in the city could look like this, we'd have a very different Dublin. And it's interesting that Dublin buildings are too easy to modify. That's always been my thesis. We don't have Nash terraces. We don't have fancy stucco. Actually, the whole of South Dublin, posh South Dublin, all along the coast, where really most people fled, the middle classes ran for the hills in the 1840s after the famine. So a whole parallel, beautiful city where all of the well-heeled now live today. That's beautiful. It's like Brighton on a vast scale. But the core of the city is these plain brick buildings that are very easy to modify, and it takes a certain restraint to actually bring them back to their fairly Spartan character, to bring back some of that integrity. And finally, we're just looking at the back building at the moment. So we've decided we're going to make this our own office. It's kind of all we need in Dublin Civic Trust, to occupy this and to separate the front building, release the capital from that, put it back on the market, or possibly engage with the local authorities or Dublin City Council, or else or others to see, ideally we would like the building in some semi-public use. And then we could take the capital from that and roll it into another project while getting a free office out of it or relatively free in the process. In the dark days of COVID, we were able to, when lockdowns kind of eased, we were able to at least begin works there was a sole surviving 1750 sash window, which was this gem in the back building. And we used it as the template to reinstate. We were so lucky. Every single one of the lovely 1750s sashes in the building. So it began to bring back some of its character. Worth noting that this is the sole surviving sash restored. It's single glazed with the original glass. And just above here we decided to slim light, double glaze, or slim profile double glaze all the other ones. So you can literally barely see the difference between the two. We're very impressed by how we managed to achieve that. That's the brick that was lurking underneath the pebble dash in that case. In this instance, the brick lost a lot more of the face. The front building was very hard, 1840s brick. This was a softer 18th century brick. We lost maybe about a third of the face of it. And therefore we had to undertake a lot of sacrificial mortar repair that is softer than the brick on a lot of the brick to bring back the arises of it. And then we rebuilt the reveals of the windows as well, which often fail because they're thinner than the rest of the wall. And that's the original penny struck pointing that we found lurking underneath the pebble dash, and just reaching the conclusion of it. These are almost like neoclassical swags, aren't they? The protective hessian. And that's the building in its current state, literally as of this morning. We're currently working up on the roof in reinstating the flat roof. So the idea is you probably remember there's kind of two horizontal slit windows on the ground floor, but there was fragments of this lovely Roman cement surround still surviving. And also we were able to work out that the massive timber head, which we suspected was here, was in fact lurking, sure enough, was revealed when we took out the big industrial windows that were put in the 20th century. And so we used good 1840s glazing patterns from elsewhere in the city to reinstate that window. And then finally, just to show you the roof, we had an awful 60s flat roof. We have reinstated the lovely 45-degree steep profile to bring it back to its original appearance, complete with chimney. Not a working chimney, but we decided to weather the gable. We might as well reinstate the chimney anyway. So we did that. And that's the lovely raggedy lime wash. We decided from an instructive point of view to show how the building had, even though it was built in the 1750s, this shop front was put in the 1840s, covering over 18th century windows. So we decided to leave it as an educational tool. And that's kind of what we're facing into now is the next phase of that hopefully will be our future office of Georgian rooms inside. So that's it, I think. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Graham. That was excellent. That was a really interesting, and obviously a lot of work has gone into that, and but a really interesting run through it. And the brickwork, as someone who's not, that into brickwork, but it looks incredible on the facade of the building. So yeah, very impressed at the job that was done there. But cool, thank you very much for that. That was excellent. So we now have a bit of time for a bit of a Q&A session. I can see that people have put questions in the chat, so I will bring those up. But if anyone does want to come on camera and ask their question, or raise their hand and ask their question live, you are more than welcome to do that. We can have this bit as a bit more of a sort of chat. But yes, so do that when you want. So the first question we got is from Sarah, which I think is a one that is all going to be on all of our minds. Is what was the most challenging conservation decision that had to be made during the project?
It probably was that side wall. To what degree we would dismantle it, and to what degree we'd be able to tie it back into the building. I have concerns myself. The scale of steel that has gone into it is significant. We often say if there's an earthquake in Dublin, probably the steel frame is the only thing that would be left standing. And that's the call that you have to make. And there's often a tussle between conservation architect and engineer. Usually an engineer comes up with a solution and there's no going back on it. our engineer is very good. He's quite flexible, but there's only so far they flex, and therefore that probably was the challenge. And therefore, I should say that in order to get those steels in, we had to take what survived of the staircase out. So the stairs had to be gingerly removed. The stairs had to be stored in other rooms in the building, which is a logistic in its own right, to make sure that the rooms aren't being used at that time, to make sure that all the elements are stored properly, that they don't get lost. And probably overall, kind of project managing it, I would say probably the biggest challenge in any conservation is keeping track of stuff that you have to remove. And generally, I think conservation officers generally recommend to keep things on site and to repair them on site. And I can see generally now, having seen how these projects develop, that there is enormous value in doing that, in keeping the fabric on site and trying to repair in situ.
I guess it's nice. I'm trying to keep track of all those things as well, moving and repairing. But yeah, and so Sarah had another question, which was, what was key to achieving a successful working collaboration with the architect? And you sort of, I guess, mentioned it there, where you were saying you had a tussle sometimes between the architect and the, was it
Yes,
the
yeah.
engineer? I can't remember
And the
who it was.
engineer, indeed, yes. Yeah. In our case, collaboration. I suppose we were very lucky. James Kelly is totally on our wavelength on everything. If anything, he's probably more conservative than we are. He's insistent on single glazing throughout, for the aesthetic that it gives to a building. Not particularly interested in heat or people's comfort within the building. Put on an extra jumper, and he's or a coat or jacket. And to be honest, I think he's right in managing expectations with an older building. So broadly, if anything, we had a very good working relationship, which probably not everybody has when it comes to their architect.
And did you have to do much negotiation between the two sides of when they had differences of opinion?
Generally not, because I think we were on the same. If anything, when it came down to budget, and that's always the case, isn't it, with every project. And perhaps that is a case, for example, in the shop, we had a part of the shop ceiling was historic, and there was a debate about how much do we spend on repairing the very ropey lath plaster that was there, or to what degree do we renew it. It was a lot cheaper to renew it than to do the patch repair, and there's a lot of layers of intervention in it. So ideally the conservation architect would run the full-on route. In that case, we did renew it, but on the basis that we were trying to keep more salvageable ceilings elsewhere in the building.
Excellent, cool, thank you. And then so our next question is from Rebecca, who says, so you spoke about the extra challenges involved in insisting on locally sourced sustainable wood. Do you feel that projects like this are having an impact and encouraging others? And Rebecca says she hopes it is.
I would hope so too, Rebecca. I suppose the reason we do these projects is to try to communicate the themes as we're doing them. I suppose we're an educational trust. We're educating the public as much as professionals. Professionals are the easy win, of course. You can do CPT courses, you can target the professional organizations, and that's where we have our bread and butter as well in terms of how we survive through education. Definitely. So we had a very recent webinar where we zoomed in precisely on this, and we had an excellent lecturer that who was a contractor as well as a teacher in his own right, and he lambasted specifiers for what they're doing in Ireland, and he was kind of obliquely mentioning or referencing projects. And I think that's needed. I think it's got to that point where it needs to be really emphatically hammered home about sourcing materials locally. So I think certainly in terms of our educational events that we have around this, we do hope. Of course, as with any project, once you paint something and you decorate it and everything looks nice and everything's closed in again, it's actually very hard to communicate these projects to the public. You can kind of tell them what has happened, but they can't actually see the process like grand designs where you've gone through the over 53 minutes of television without breaks, how it's happened over 2 years or 3 years, and you've seen what it was. In the case, it's usually the public see the building before and they see it after, and it's pretty difficult to even get people on site. It's a big challenge to get a contractor who's willing to allow 20, 30 architects on the scaffolding and to give up a day or 2 days and all the preparation that goes into that. never mind members of the public. So it is a challenge, and therefore you just have to say it. So on public tours, open house, and all of these things where we've hundreds, thousands of people passing through the building, you just have to be very frank and honest about the positive aspects as well as the pitfalls and the challenges that we face like everyone else. And it's trying to get away from maybe the public perception of precious conservation, and you're just doing this because you're indulging yourselves and using grant money and all the rest of it. Far from it. We have none of the resources of the private sector, and yet we want to be honest about what we're doing and showcase the pluses and the minuses of these projects.
Cool, thank you. And I'm going to jump in with one of my own questions now before I ask the next one. But because I was wondering, so as well as like Rebecca said about the sustainable wood, were there any other choices that you made during the redevelopment about looking for more environmentally sustainable options that you might use in future projects?
Yes, wherever we could, we tried to recycle timber in the building and to recycle it as timber heads over windows and doors. If there was new openings being created, we tried to, because there was quite a bit of timber. And particularly in one case where there was historic beams that we needed to insert steel exactly in the place where the beam was for the structural integrity of the building. But we kind of satisfied ourselves that we could use that timber elsewhere in the building. And we found a lot of evidence of that being done historically. So there was kind of a continuity in that sense. We're probably kicking ourselves. Well, we're not kicking ourselves because it was the thing at the time. We installed a gas boiler. Don't want a gas boiler. The gas boiler is actually sitting beside me here, and we've still yet to connect it 7 years on. It feels like a dinosaur sitting in the corner of the room. And we're a south-facing building on the river, so we get the full blast of solar gain. At the time, heat pumps were hugely expensive. There's nowhere to put it in a building of this kind. There was no grants available. To this day, there's full grant. The grants are hugely generous in Ireland for retrofit, but not for protected structures or listed buildings. We call them protected structures here. And they don't apply for protected structures, which is extraordinary. And on the basis that you must make your building heat pump ready, which is probably the case in Britain as well. You need to super insulate your house before they'll give you the grant for the heat pump. So it doesn't apply with an old building. So the gas hasn't been connected as yet. And it is interesting working in a building that gets enormous solar gain. It does go to show that really only for about 3 months of the year it's cold, and for the rest it actually manages to survive really without heating. So we would probably use an electric solution if we were going down that road today.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, if you've not got the gas boiler connected, what do you use instead? But I guess, like you say, just the sunlight and natural is
plug-in radiators. Yeah.
Cool. Our next question is from Kate, which is the revolving fund appears to have worked well, but if property is now so expensive, will you be able to continue your excellent work?
It's a very good question, Kate. It's not easy. And you're competing with developers, and often you're not competing for the building, you're competing for the site value of the building. Certainly things have improved. The Celtic Tiger was pretty appalling for mass site assembly of traditional buildings of the likes of Ormond Quay, 6, 7 buildings along a streetscape, mass demolition, replacement with a large block. That has changed. Even for non-protected buildings, it's considered, the city is, I think, a lot more conscious of retaining the hierarchy and the grain of the rhythm of the city in that sense. You're right. I suppose that the good thing is, from a trading up point of view, like if you have a lot of capital in your house, you're in a position to do that. In our case, we're kind of at that level where the building is worth, give or take, probably €1.5 million, I'd imagine. So, but the problem is that even a fairly derelict building in the centre of Dublin is worth a lot of money today. So a lot of that would go into the purchase price, and we would need to fundraise, like we had to do with this building, in order to at least meet some of the refurbishment cost. But at least we're in a better position. We're certainly not at the bottom of the market. We have good embodied value in this building, which is a good place to be for the point of view of the next project. Well, I would say, I suppose maybe the other, the bigger question perhaps is what do you do with your building now? The whole kind of noble idea of a civic trust in the 1950s of saving a building, which is wonderful, but nowadays it's, you know, regulations, planning permission, building regs, societal expectation, especially in Ireland where there's a big housing crisis. Our big question going forward is, what is the use of your building going to be? That's the number one thing. You need to put the developer's hat on if you're working in a city centre. What's the commercial, do the figures stack up? And how far do you go in the finish that you deploy? And how do you manage crack the nut, which is the big problem in Dublin, of sensitively converting upper floors into multiple units. That's the big challenge in terms of fire, lobbying staircases, changing the plan and the character and the layout of the building in order to accommodate bathrooms, kitchens, services, and how to do that from and particularly crippling fire regulations that are really imposed to the letter of the law in Dublin. Even not in other parts of the country, but Dublin in particular is very challenging, and it's not really in the broader interest of historic buildings. And affordable accommodation. So that's what we need to look at going forward is what is the best financial model in terms of the end use of the building to actually, and also to demonstrate that, yes, the historic buildings have a relevancy by virtue of the return that they deliver.
That sounds like quite the challenge, but an exciting one, hopefully. I'm just conscious of time, so if anyone does have any final questions, do pop them in the chat now. Final quick questions. I will just have a quick check so I can see some stuff. So Kate quickly said, we spoke earlier about the impact of getting a Europa Nostra award. Could you enlarge on what it did for you? And then we'll say that's
Great,
the last question.
Indeed, like we were saying earlier, it certainly put us on the map. Also on the, I suppose, the Dublin Civic Trust, but particularly the focus of you know, the object, the building itself, which is what we wanted to actually show that street buildings are of value, that urbanism is of value. Urbanism is massively underappreciated in this country. A political focus is largely on suburban development and one-off house syndrome. We always laugh when we watch Grand Designs or Kirsty and Phil or any of that stuff. It is amazing to see the extraordinary or relative planning restrictions in Britain when it comes to green belts or building one-off houses. We have probably the most sprawling, dispersed population in Europe, in Ireland, due to a complete laissez-faire approach to planning. So we have just shy of 500,000 one-off houses in Ireland for a population of 5 million people. So goodness knows, probably a quarter of the population live in a house in a field or suburban generated housing. It's hugely car dependent, and the value placed on our town centres and our villages have been hollowing out on an enormous scale over the past 30 years, which the recession of recent times really revealed. Now the country is booming and everyone's scratching their heads suddenly wondering, well, what are all of these decayed towns, you know, these urban centres? So it is now very much government focused to target investment into public realm, into incentives for refurbishment of vacant buildings. And we would like to think that this is kind of the poster child for how that can be done. It's much easier in our case in that we bought the building as an entity. In many cases, the complexities of somebody might own the ground floor and somebody else owns upstairs, or you know, the big challenge of, you know, in the Irish town, you have the chipper and the bookies and the nightclub and that type of thing, and nobody wants to live on the main street or even the secondary streets because of those raucous uses that make it unviable to do it. So it's kind of turning that ship around to ideally make towns dormitories, because increasingly people are working elsewhere in fringe city or edge city, and actually make the towns sustainable, these beautiful ready built places as places to live, and actually turn kind of the 20th century on its head in terms of that pattern. So Ormond Quay kind of did that, and showing the value of average street buildings as a replicable project, something that the judge noted, I think, Sarah noted at the start there, about what the judge saw as the universal value of this project that could be applied elsewhere. And that was the overarching objective of why he wanted to do it. And certainly in the case of even just the quay along here, 2 other buildings have been, since this building was done, have been conserved to really good conservation practice. And the planners at every point have referenced this building as that. So it is certainly influence there, and hopefully it will have more tentacles of influence.
Excellent, cool. Thank you very much, Graham. And that does very nicely, neatly bring us to the end of the evening. So a massive thank you to you, Graham, again for joining us and for giving us that really insightful seminar. And thank you to everyone else who has been involved behind the scenes of organising and producing the webinar. If you enjoyed this, this is, as I say, one of a series that we're running, and we do have the next few now agreed. So in March, we'll be joined by the Friends of Czech Heritage. May will be joined by Cleveland Pools Trust, and in July we'll be joined by the researchers on the Mini Airy manuscript heritage project from the Fitzwilliam Museum. So if people are interested in them, we will be promoting them and putting the tickets out very soon. So keep an eye out for them and do come along. In the meantime, if you know about a project that deserves to win a European Heritage Award, please look out for the call for the 2025 awards. Details of the categories and process can be found on our dedicated the Europa Nostra website. So I will just pop that in the chat now. So do have a look. But other than that, final thank you to Graham, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Hopefully see you at the next seminar.
Great. Thanks, Ollie, so much. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Great. Great.
And then if you just stop recording.